She was just a waitress. He was the most feared crime lord in New Orleans. One night changed everything. Now she carries his child in a fortress surrounded by armed guards, while a Russian mob boss is hunting them both like prey. And when a beautiful stranger walks into Min-Jae's office and wraps her arms around him like she owns him, Zara doesn't cry. She doesn't beg. She makes one phone call, lifts her chin, and decides that if this man wants to keep her, he is going to have to choose.
Right now.
Welcome to Unfold Korean Stories, besties. If this story already has your heart racing, you are exactly where you belong. Please share this with someone who loves a love story that hits differently. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what we unfold next, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. We are a whole community out here, and we want to see you. Min-Jae visited every 3 days like clockwork, always arriving after dark when the roads were quietest and the guards least visible from the highway. Zara had started to measure time by his arrivals, counting the hours between one and the next the way her grandmother used to count rosary beads, each one a small prayer against the silence. The Lafayette house was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are, all clean lines and carefully chosen textures, but it had no soul yet. No smell of Zara's particular brand of chaos, no stack of nursing textbooks threatening to slide off the kitchen table, no half-empty mug of tea forgotten on the windowsill because she'd gotten distracted by a sunset.
She was working on that.
She'd hung a cloth from Ghana above the fireplace, a bright Kent pattern that her grandmother had tucked into her luggage all those years ago when she first left for America, saying that a piece of home should always travel with you. It was the first thing Min-Jae noticed on his 4th visit, pausing in the doorway of the living room with his jacket still on, staring at the fabric like it had said something meaningful to him.
You decorated, he said.
I refuse to live inside a hotel for the next 7 months, Zara told him from the kitchen, where she was stirring a pot of light soup and trying to ignore the way her stomach lurched at the smell of the palm oil heating in the pan. The morning sickness had evolved into something the doctors had optimistically named all-day sickness, and she'd had a particularly brutal week of it. He crossed the room in 5 long strides and pulled her away from the stove, turning her around to look at her properly. His eyes did that thing they always did when he first saw her after days apart, that slow sweep from head to toe like he was cataloging every change, reassuring himself that she was whole and real and still there. Dark circles sat beneath her eyes that she hadn't quite managed to conceal with concealer, and her cheekbones were a little more prominent than they'd been a month ago, all those lost meals adding up. His jaw tightened.
You're not eating enough, he said.
I'm trying, she said, turning back to the stove. The smell of almost everything makes me sick right now. Palm oil is the one thing that actually seems okay, so I'm working with what I've got. He was quiet for a moment, then she heard him moving behind her, opening cabinet doors, the refrigerator. When she looked over her shoulder, he'd removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and was standing at the counter with a completely focused expression, like he was about to close a business deal, examining what she had available. Zara blinked. What are you doing? My mother's remedy for morning sickness, he said without looking up. She swore by it when she was pregnant with my younger brother. He died, she said quietly, the words landing soft and private in the air between them. Born too early, only lived 3 days. She never made the soup again after that. He paused for just a fraction of a second, his hands stilling over a ginger root he'd found at the back of the vegetable drawer. But I remember exactly how she made it. Zara set down her spoon. Min-Jae, you don't have to. I want to, he said, and his voice had that particular texture it got when he was being the most honest version of himself, stripped of all the crime boss armor and the carefully managed expressions. Let me do something useful. I've been going insane sitting in New Orleans knowing you're here, and I can't do anything. She moved aside and let him work. It was strange and intimate and surprisingly moving, watching this man who controlled an empire of violence and shadow stand in her kitchen and carefully peel ginger the way his mother had taught him, his large hands gentle with the root, his movements precise and unhurried. He added things to a small pot as he went, murmuring the Korean names under his breath like he was reciting something sacred. The kitchen filled with a warm, sharp scent that cut right through the nausea. She sat on the counter and watched him cook, and she thought about all the versions of himself he carried quietly inside him. The boy and soul whose father had left a scar on his eyebrow, and a deeper one somewhere she couldn't see. The young man who'd built an empire out of desperation and survival. The man who'd looked at her across a crowded club and seen something worth pausing his entire life for. They were all the same person, she was slowly learning. None of them were the whole story. When he brought her a small cup of the ginger broth, she wrapped her hands around it and breathed in the steam before tasting it. It was warm and clean and surprisingly comforting, settling against the churning in her stomach like a gentle hand. Something in her expression must have said everything he needed to hear, because his shoulders dropped about 2 inches with relief.
"Thank you," she said.
He sat across from her, his elbows on the kitchen table, watching her sip the broth.
He looked exhausted.
Not the surface exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept, but the deeper kind, the bone-level kind that builds up when someone has been fighting too hard for too long. Zara set down the cup and looked at him directly.
"Tell me about Victor," she said.
His expression shifted. "You don't need to worry about Victor. Min-Jae." He met her eyes and held them. "The attack last week hit 3 of our businesses simultaneously, perfectly coordinated. Whoever planned it knew our security rotations are blind spots. Someone on my side is feeding information to Victor's people." He said it evenly, but she could see the controlled fury underneath. "We've narrowed it down to 1 of 3 men. I'll know for certain by the end of the week." Zara thought about what knowing for certain meant in his world, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "And when you know?" He looked at her steadily. "I'll handle it."
She didn't ask anything else about that.
Some walls she'd learned to leave in place, not because she was afraid of what was behind them, but because pushing through them wouldn't change anything. What she could change was the look on his face, the way he held his exhaustion like it was a weight he'd simply accepted as permanent. "You need to sleep," she said. "I'm fine. You look like something Jiwoo pulled out of the bayou." He blinked, and then against his obvious will, the corner of his mouth twitched. "She reports to me, you know. I could have her reassigned."
"She knows where I keep the good chocolate," Zara said.
"So you'd better not." He actually laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that transformed his face the way a sudden break in storm clouds transforms a landscape. Zara felt it in her chest every single time, that laugh. It was one of the rarest and most beautiful things she'd ever been trusted to witness. She made him stay the night. He argued that he had meetings early in New Orleans, and she argued back that meetings could happen on the phone, and Jiwoo, who had excellent hearing and the diplomacy of a Swiss ambassador, quietly disappeared to her own quarters at the other end of the house. They fell asleep tangled together in the big bedroom with its windows that looked out over the garden, and Zara woke at some point in the deep dark hours to find Min-Jae still sleeping beside her, his face finally relaxed, the constant vigilance gone from his features. She lay awake for a while just watching him breathe, this impossible man who had crashed into her life 9 months ago, who had turned everything she'd planned upside down and sideways, and she tried to imagine her life without him and found that she couldn't. That was terrifying in its own particular way, loving someone this much with no guarantee of anything. She pressed her palm very gently against her barely there stomach and whispered into the dark, "I'm going to figure this out for you. I promise." The 12-week ultrasound appointment happened on a Tuesday morning at the end of October, the sky outside the Lafayette house the particular bruised purple of an autumn dawn that hadn't quite committed to being day yet. The Dr. Min-Jae had hired was a small Korean-American woman named Dr. Park, who had the efficient warmth of someone who had attended several thousand of these appointments and never lost interest in a single one. She arrived at 8 sharp with a portable ultrasound machine and a nurse named Celeste who had the easiest smile Zara had ever encountered. Min-Jae was there. He'd driven from New Orleans in the dark, arriving just before the doctor, still in yesterday's suit with his tie loosened and his eyes red from a night that clearly hadn't involved much sleep. He'd brought an enormous bunch of flowers that he'd obviously purchased at an all-night gas station, several different kinds thrown together with the cheerful randomness of a man operating on adrenaline, and when he handed them to Zara, she had to turn away quickly to blink back tears because even half-wilted carnations from a gas station felt like the most romantic gesture she'd ever received. Alma was there too, cross-legged in the armchair in the corner of the bedroom, wearing her sleeping bonnet and a University of New Orleans sweatshirt because she'd spent the night and no one had told her to dress up for a prenatal ultrasound. She had her phone out to film, and when Zara raised an eyebrow at her, she shrugged with absolute unrepentance. "Your grandmother is going to want to see everything," she said. "I'm the designated documentarian." Dr. Park prepared the equipment with efficient movements, while Celeste arranged a pillow under Zara's back and handed her a blanket with the practiced warmth of someone who understood that medical appointments could feel cold in multiple ways. Min-Jae pulled a chair to Zara's left side and sat close enough that their arms touched, and when Zara reached for his hand without really thinking about it, she felt him exhale very slowly, like he'd been holding that particular breath since he arrived. The gel was cold despite what Celeste promised about warming it. Zara winced, and Min-Jae immediately tensed beside her. The doctor moved the transducer, and the screen filled with gray and white static and shapes that made no sense until suddenly they did. A curve. A profile. The unmistakable hammer flutter of a tiny heartbeat. Min-Jae made a sound she'd never heard from him before. Not a word, not quite. Something that started in his chest and came out of his throat raw and unguarded, and she turned to look at him and found his jaw working silently, his dark eyes fixed on the screen with an expression that cracked her completely open. He looked like a man confronting the impossible, like a man who had lived his entire adult life in a world where nothing was sacred and had just been shown something that was. "That's your baby," Dr. Park said, her voice professionally gentle. 12 weeks and 2 days. Heart rate is excellent. Development looks perfect. Perfect, Min-Jae repeated, barely a sound. Alma made a sound from the corner that was definitely crying disguised as a cough. Nobody called her out on it. "Do you want to know the sex?" Dr. Park asked. "It's a bit early, but with this equipment I might be able to tell." Zara and Min-Jae looked at each other simultaneously. It had been the kind of wordless question that she'd noticed developing between them over the past months, this ability to ask something with just a glance and receive a complete answer. He was asking what she wanted. She was asking the same thing. "Not yet," they both said at the exact same moment, and then Alma made the not crying sound again, and this time Celeste handed her a tissue with the subtle efficiency of someone who had seen this happen many times before. After Dr. Park left, Min-Jae sat on the edge of the bed beside Zara and held the small printed image from the ultrasound in both hands, studying it with the same focused attention he probably gave strategic documents. He turned it sideways, then back. He was quiet for so long that Alma slipped out of the room with a subtle grace that was completely unlike her normal personality and closed the door behind her. "I've made so many wrong choices in my life," Min-Jae said finally, without looking up from the image. "Things that would make you sick if I told you the full truth. Things I can't take back and can't make right." His voice was quiet and steady, but she could feel the weight underneath it. "And then somehow I ended up here. With you. And this." He finally looked at her, and his expression was stripped entirely clean, nothing hidden, nothing managed. "I'm going to get out," he said. Not a promise made in the heat of emotion this time. Something more deliberate and considered, the kind of statement that comes after a person has spent days turning a decision over in the dark and made their peace with it. "I've been talking to someone. Quietly. An attorney in Chicago who specializes in situations like mine, transitioning out of organized crime with minimal legal exposure. It's complicated and it'll take time. Maybe a year. Victor makes it more urgent." He looked back at the ultrasound image. "But that does too." Zara was quiet, afraid to speak in case it broke something fragile. "I can't ask you to wait," he said. "I don't have the right to." "You're not asking," she said. "I'm telling you that I will." He finally set down the image and looked at her fully, something unlocking in his expression that she recognized as the particular relief of a person who has been carrying a secret fear and been given permission to set it down. "Marry me," he said again. "Not right now, not until I've done what I said I'm going to do. But say you will. Give me that to hold on to." Zara reached over and took the ultrasound image from his hands and held it up between them, the small curve of their future visible in black and white. "Ask me again when you're out," she said. "And I'll say yes." The weeks that followed had a quality of suspended reality, days stretching long and quiet in the Lafayette house, while the world outside continued to move at its dangerous pace. Zara fell into the rhythm of pregnancy with a kind of fierce determination, treating it the way she'd always treated every challenge in her life, by learning everything possible and refusing to be overwhelmed. She read every book Dr. Park recommended, and several she found herself, filled a notebook with questions for each appointment, started prenatal yoga in the large back room that she and Jiwoo had cleared of its storage boxes and turned into a makeshift studio. Jiwoo joined her for the yoga sessions after the first week, explaining with characteristic Korean directness that her job was to protect Zara's body and she couldn't do that effectively without understanding how it was changing. This was almost certainly not the real reason, but Zara appreciated the logic and didn't push. Alma came every weekend, making the drive from New Orleans with alarming enthusiasm and usually a bag full of things Zara hadn't realized she needed until they arrived. Crackers for the nausea. A body pillow of architectural proportions. A second-hand copy of a Ghanaian parenting book she'd found at a used bookstore that was written in 1973 and had some extraordinary opinions about child-rearing that made both of them cry laughing in the kitchen at midnight. Jiwoo sat at the table on these occasions with her green tea and watched them with the expression of someone taking detailed anthropological notes. Min-Jae's visits became something Zara organized her weeks around with an awareness that she didn't entirely love about herself, but accepted as the truth. He came on Tuesdays and Saturdays when he could, and when he couldn't, he called. The calls could last minutes or hours, depending on what his night looked like, and Zara learned to hold the phone with one hand and her textbook with the other, studying while he talked her through whatever crisis was unfolding in abbreviated, carefully coded language that she'd slowly learned to translate. When it was quiet on his end, she'd read aloud to him from her nursing materials, and he'd listen in a way that she suspected had very little to do with an interest in pharmacology and everything to do with the sound of her voice. "I know what tachycardia means now," he told her one night with dry seriousness. "And I'm slightly concerned about the number of my associates who should probably see a cardiologist." She laughed at that harder than the joke warranted, because she was 16 weeks pregnant and had been indoors for a month, and laughter had started to feel like a necessary medicine. The threat from Victor hadn't disappeared. Marcus called her directly one evening in November, which was unusual enough that her heart immediately jumped. "Victor's people tried to pick up Min-Jae's shipping lawyer this morning," Marcus said without preamble, because Marcus never wasted time on preamble. "They backed off when our security team intervened. Nobody hurt, but it's an escalation. Min-Jae didn't want you to hear this from anyone else." She sat with that for a moment. "Is Min-Jae safe? He's got 12 guys on him right now. He's safe. You're safe. That's what matters. Tell him to call me. He's in the middle of something." Marcus. A beat of silence. "I'll tell him," he said. Min-Jae called 20 minutes later, his voice carefully level. "I should have called you first." "Yes, you should have." Zara was sitting on the back steps of the house, the garden dark around her, the Louisiana night full of insect sound. "But you're okay?" "I'm fine. I need you to hear something," she said. "Whatever is happening out there, whatever decisions you're making right now, you cannot be reckless. You're not just you anymore. You're this baby's father. You're my person. You don't get to be reckless with that." A long pause. His voice when he spoke again was different. Quieter. "My person," he repeated. "Don't make it weird." She heard the low sound of his laugh, and something in her unlocked. "I'm being careful," he said. "I promise you." She wasn't sure she entirely believed him, but she held on to it anyway. The trip to Los Angeles had been discussed and postponed 3 times for security reasons, but in the 3rd week of November, Marcus declared a brief window of relative calm, and Min-Jae drove to Lafayette, picked up Zara and Jiwoo, and they flew on a private plane to Los Angeles with enough security to suggest Min-Jae had decided to simply import the concept of excessive caution from New Orleans to the West Coast. Zara sat next to him on the plane and watched the Gulf of Mexico disappear beneath the clouds, her hand resting on the small but unmistakable curve of her belly. 17 weeks. She was starting to feel the baby move, the first whisper flutter sensations that the books described as butterflies, and that felt to Zara more like a fish turning in deep water, gentle and liquid and astonishing. Min-Jae's mother's care facility was in Pasadena, a low building surrounded by carefully maintained gardens that were doing their professional best to not look like what they were. The staff knew Min-Jae by name and received him with the particular careful warmth that facilities like this reserved for family members who paid well and visited frequently enough to be familiar. He'd told Zara this morning was usually a better time, that his mother's clarity came and went with the hours, and that mornings held it longer. He'd also told her, very quietly in the car on the way in, that his mother knew about Zara. He told her on a good day 3 weeks ago, and she'd cried, he said. Happy crying, he clarified quickly, seeing Zara's expression.
She said it was past time.
Park Soon-hee was 71 years old and had been beautiful in the way that certain women remain beautiful despite everything life has taken from them, through the sheer force of whatever it is that makes them who they are. She was small and precise in her movements, sitting upright in a chair by her window when they came in, and her eyes, when they lifted to her son, had the specific quality of a person assembling themselves, the way you assemble a room before guests arrive. Then they moved to Zara, and something else came into them. Something that made Zara's throat tighten immediately. Come here, she said in Korean, and Min-Jae translated barely, a beat behind. Zara came to her and took her hands when she reached for them, and Park Soon-hee held both of Zara's hands between her own and studied her face with an intensity that felt like being read. She said something in Korean, and Min-Jae's translation was a moment slow, roughened by something he was managing carefully. She says your eyes are kind, he said. She says her son needed someone with kind eyes. He's been teaching me, Zara said to her, knowing she'd understand the intent even if the translation took a moment. He's going to be a good father. The words hit Park Soon-hee somewhere deep and visible. Her hands tightened around Zara's. She spoke again, longer this time, and when Min-Jae translated, his voice was rough enough that he had to stop once and start again. She says she was afraid he'd become his father. He managed. She says she blamed herself for a long time. For not protecting him. For not leaving sooner. She says she prays every night that whatever sins she committed in her choices, they don't fall on him. That he gets to be different. Zara looked at this small woman holding her hands and thought about all the things mothers carry, the specific weight of loving a child into a broken world and trying to shield them from it, and failing in some ways and succeeding in others, and never being sure which was which. She thought about her own mother, who she barely remembered. She thought about her grandmother, who had measured love and sacrifice so long it had become its own language. He is different, Zara said carefully. He's trying very hard to be. Park Soon-hee looked past her then, at her son standing in the doorway of her room with his hands in his pockets, and his face doing the thing it did when he was trying to contain too much at once. She said something quietly, just to him, just a few words. Min-Jae's jaw worked. His eyes went bright. She says he translated very low. She says she forgives me. Zara quietly stepped aside and let the two of them have the moment that had clearly been waiting a very long time to arrive. She moved to the window and looked out at the garden, giving them privacy, and when she heard the sound of Min-Jae's breath catching in the way it does when a person is trying not to cry and losing the argument, she felt something settle in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. Heavy but permanent.
Right.
They stayed for 2 hours. The good clarity held through most of it, and Park Soon-hee asked Zara questions through Min-Jae about nursing school, about Ghana, about what food Zara wanted during the pregnancy, and what names she liked. At one point she held Zara's face in her hands the way Zara's grandmother used to, studying her with the particular authority of a woman who has earned the right to look at things directly. Then she looked at her son and said something long, and Min-Jae stood very still while she said it, and when she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. What did she say? Zara asked. She said he began and stopped. Cleared his throat. She said, don't let her go the way I let your father go, trying to love something unlovable into changing. She said, Zara is already who you need. You be who she needs. Zara looked at Park Soon-hee and the old woman nodded at her, small and certain, like a decision had been confirmed. On the plane back to Louisiana, Min-Jae sat with Zara's feet in his lap the way he'd taken to doing when she was tired, because her ankles were starting to protest the Louisiana humidity and long stretches of sitting. He was quiet in a way that felt purposeful rather than empty, the silence of a person processing something large. "Did you know she'd say that?" Zara asked. "To forgive you?"
"No," he said.
"I thought it would take longer. I thought I'd have to earn it more." "She probably decided a long time ago," Zara said. "Parents usually do." He absorbed that. His hand moved absently over her ankle, warm and steady. The plane's engines hummed around them. "I'm meeting with a Chicago attorney next week," he said. "In person. Marcus is setting up the security arrangement." Zara didn't say anything. She just pressed her foot more firmly against his hand, a small pressure of acknowledgement. Victor made another move the following week, and this one was different in a way that traveled quickly through the chain of people who kept Zara informed. He didn't hit businesses this time. He sent a message directly to Min-Jae through a lawyer, which meant it was something he wanted on record. The message was an offer, a purchase of Min-Jae's entire operation, territory and contacts and distribution networks, at a price that was insultingly low and obviously not meant seriously. It was the kind of offer that was really a declaration. A statement about who held the power to make demands. Min-Jae called Zara the night it happened, and she could hear the controlled rage underneath his voice, that particular compression of fury that came when he was deciding between impulse and strategy. "Don't do anything because of ego," she told him. "This isn't ego. It's a little bit ego." A pause. "It's mostly ego," he allowed. "But it's also about what happens if Victor takes over these routes. The people who depend on our protection arrangements, who depend on stability. This isn't just about territory." Zara had been thinking about this more than she let on. She'd been slowly, carefully, learning the architecture of what Min-Jae controlled, understanding that the reality was more complicated than Crime Boss made it sound on television. There were structures of dependency and protection that had been built over years. There were also people who had been hurt and exploited, and there was no pretending otherwise. "What does your attorney say?" she asked. "That Victor is actually useful leverage. That a willing transfer of territory to a third party could be structured in a way that protects me legally. He's working on it. So let him work. It's not that simple." "Simplify it," Zara said. "You have one real job right now, and it's to be alive and present for this baby's arrival. Everything else is secondary." Another pause. She could picture him exactly, standing somewhere in the Midnight Paradise penthouse with his hand on the back of his neck, looking out at the city lights. "You know," he said, "most of the men who work for me are terrified of my opinion of them. And you tell me to simplify it like it's a math problem. Is it not a math problem?" His laugh, low and exhausted and genuine, was the sound she needed to hear most in that moment. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. "Go to sleep." "Tell the baby I said hello." "Tell the baby yourself," she said. "Press your phone against my stomach and talk." "You're joking." "I'm absolutely not." A long pause. Then, very quietly, as though he was doing something he wasn't entirely sure was dignified but had decided was worth it anyway, she heard him begin to speak Korean into the phone, his voice soft and steady and warm in a way that she rarely heard it in public. She didn't understand the words. She didn't need to. December arrived with unseasonable warmth and the news that Min-Jae's meeting in Chicago had gone well enough to move to the next stage, which Marcus described as promising and Min-Jae described as complicated but possible, and Zara's knowledge of the details extended only as far as they chose to share, which she'd made peace with. She was 20 weeks pregnant. She was halfway to the end. She was studying for an exam in geriatric patient care that she intended to take online in January and pass, with a score that would have satisfied her grandmother. These were the things inside her circle. Everything outside it, she was learning to hold with open hands. The gender reveal happened on a Thursday afternoon in December with no ceremony whatsoever. Dr. Park was doing a routine appointment. Alma was sitting in the corner eating jollof rice from a container she'd brought from New Orleans. Jiwoo was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, and Min-Jae was there, having arrived the previous night and slept a full 8 hours for what Zara suspected was the first time in weeks. He looked measurably better. He'd had his hair cut and was wearing a sweater instead of a suit, and the difference it made to how young he looked was startling. Dr. Park was mid-scan when she said, very matter-of-factly, "Do you want to know today?" "The angle's perfect." Min-Jae and Zara looked at each other again, with that wordless language. "Yes," they said simultaneously. "You're having a girl," Dr. Park said. The room was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then Alma made a sound that could only be described as a war cry, dropped her container of jollof rice, and flung herself at Zara with such force that Jiwoo actually took a half-step forward before realizing it was celebratory rather than threatening. Dr. Park quietly steadied her equipment. Min-Jae sat absolutely still, his hand tight around Zara's, his eyes on the screen where his daughter was visible in precise grayscale, her profile perfect, her heartbeat steady and strong. "A girl," he said, barely audible. "A girl," Zara confirmed. She watched him work through it, whatever it was, the enormity of a particular life arriving into the particular world he'd been living in. She watched him decide something, though she couldn't have named what it was, could only feel the shift in the quality of his stillness, the way a decision you've been circling finally becomes a fact. "She's going to be extraordinary," he said. "Like her mother." Alma, who had finally detached herself from Zara, pointed at him. "That was a good answer," she said approvingly. "Write that down somewhere." Min-Jae actually smiled at her. He and Alma had arrived at a relationship that Zara found privately hilarious, a mutual wariness that had slowly evolved into something like wary respect, with Alma testing his edges regularly and Min-Jae responding with a dry patience that seemed to genuinely surprise Alma, who had been expecting someone easier to antagonize. That evening, after Dr. Park had gone and Jiwoo had diplomatically vanished and Alma had claimed the guest room with her usual territorial efficiency, Min-Jae sat on the back steps with Zara while the Louisiana dark settled around them, dense and warm even in December. "I want to name her after my mother," he said. "If you're willing." Zara thought about Park Soon-hee in her Pasadena chair, holding her hands. The weight of that look, the forgiveness given. "What's her full name?" Zara asked. "Park Soon-hee. But her given name, just Soon-hee, it means jade and righteousness." "Soon-hee," Zara said slowly, letting it sit in her mouth. "Then my grandmother's name is Abina. It means born on Tuesday." He turned to look at her. "What day was she born?" She smiled. "Tuesday." He considered.
"Soon-hee Abina," he said.
Zara felt the rightness of it move through her. "Soon-hee Abina," she agreed. They sat with a name hanging between them in the warm dark, their daughter's name, solid and real, and Zara felt time move through her in a way it sometimes did these days, the strange layering of past and present and approaching future. She thought about a Tuesday morning in Accra when her grandmother had sent her to the airport with a single suitcase and a piece of Kent cloth and a promise that crossing an ocean was not the same as leaving home. She thought about 9 months ago, a crowded nightclub, a tray of champagne, a man in the shadows who looked at her like she was the first real thing he'd seen in years. She thought about 2 pink lines on 3 different pregnancy tests and how the floor had felt solid and not solid beneath her at the same time. She thought about her daughter's heartbeat on the ultrasound screen, steady and persistent and unimpressed by anything complicated the adults around her might be working through.
"Min-Jae," she said.
He looked at her. "I want you to stop protecting me from information," she said. "I mean the Victor situation. What's happening with your operation? I want to know. Not the operational details, not who's doing what, but the shape of what's coming." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might push back. "Victor's not going to accept the offer on the table," he said finally. "My attorney believes he's planning something more direct. Something designed to force my hand before the legal transition can be finalized."
He paused.
"Which means the next few weeks are the most dangerous point." Zara absorbed this.
"Jiwoo?"
She knows. She's already adjusted the security arrangements here. There are 4 additional people on the perimeter you haven't noticed because they're actually good at their jobs. She hadn't noticed. Zara made a note to herself about the perimeter. "How long?" "My attorney thinks we can finalize the transition documents by February. Once they're signed and registered and the relevant parties are informed, Victor has no leverage. Anything he does after that is personal rather than strategic, and Victor is not a personal kind of man. And until February? I stay very careful, he said. And you stay here.
Zara looked at him.
He looked back at her, waiting for an argument. She didn't give him one, because the calculation was clear enough and she'd done it already on her own, and arrived at the same conclusion. This wasn't about being kept. It was about being strategic. You call me every day, she said instead. Every day. And when the transition is done, we revisit the conversation about New Orleans. About normal. About Suni growing up somewhere where Jiwoo doesn't need to walk the perimeter. He reached over and took her hand in the dark. After February, he said. Everything after February. The weeks leading to Christmas were quiet in the way that precedes complicated things, a surface stillness over something moving beneath. Marcus drove out to Lafayette twice to walk the security arrangements with Jiwoo personally, the two of them conferring in the clipped shorthand of people who both took their jobs seriously and had arrived at mutual professional respect. Alma came every weekend and FaceTimed Zara's grandmother from Ghana from the living room, spending hours in a mixture of Twi and English, while Zara's grandmother, whose name was Abina and who was 83 years old and had never once in her life been easy about anything, asked questions about Min-Jae with a directness that made Zara grateful for the language barrier even as Alma translated faithfully and with clearly suppressed enjoyment. She wants to know if he prays, Alma reported during one of these sessions. Tell her he's working on it, Zara called from the kitchen. She wants to know if he can provide for you. Tell her he has provided the house I'm currently living in, the doctor who comes to my door, and a security guard who has learned to make jollof rice. There was a pause while Alma translated. Then Alma's laughter, and the particular sound Zara recognized as her grandmother attempting to contain something. She says, Alma reported, that a man who makes sure a woman is fed is at least half a good man. The other half depends on whether he stays. Zara stood very still in the kitchen for a moment with her hand against her stomach, her daughter turning her small, slow turns in the dark. Tell her he's staying, she said. Min-Jae arrived on Christmas Eve in the evening, and he brought an enormous amount of luggage for someone who usually traveled with a single bag, which Zara found suspicious until he explained that Marcus had packed most of it, and Marcus had opinions about holiday gifts that apparently involved quantity. The back of the car contained more wrapped boxes than Zara had ever received collectively in her life, an observation she shared with some bewilderment. I told him moderate, Min-Jae said, looking at the boxes himself with the expression of a man who had also just realized the scale of the situation. Jiwoo helped carry them in without comment, though Zara caught the slight softening around her eyes that was Jiwoo's version of amusement. They cooked dinner together that night, Zara directing and Min-Jae executing, a meal that was Ghanaian and Korean and completely neither, kelaweel alongside japchae, Min-Jae's ginger broth next to Zara's palm nut soup, the kitchen full of competing wonderful smells and occasional negotiation about oven space. Jiwoo ate with them at the big table, which had stopped being unusual sometime in October and had simply become how things were, and they talked about inconsequential things with the particular ease of people who know that the consequential things are waiting and have made an unspoken decision to set them down for one evening. After dinner, Alma performed an elaborate production of Needing to Go to Bed Early that fooled absolutely nobody and was appreciated by everyone, and Jiwoo performed a similar production involving perimeter checks, and Zara and Min-Jae were left alone in the living room with the Christmas lights she'd strung around the windows and the Kent cloth above the fireplace, and the quiet around them full of warmth. He produced a small box from his jacket pocket. Not the luggage Marcus had packed. Something he'd been carrying himself. I was going to wait until February, he said. Until everything was finished. But I've been carrying this since October, and I'm not very good at waiting anymore. The ring inside the box was not what she'd expected. Not enormous or ostentatious. It was a simple band of gold with a small panel of Kent-patterned enamel work on the surface, the colors exactly right, worked by someone who clearly knew what Kent was and what it meant. I had it made, he said. An artist in Atlanta, she specializes in cultural heritage jewelry. I sent her photographs of your cloth, the one above the fireplace. Zara couldn't speak. She was too busy blinking rapidly and breathing carefully, and trying to maintain any composure whatsoever. I'm not finished yet, he said, his voice lower. I'm still working on becoming the man you deserve. On building something clean out of what I've had my hands in. I know that. And I know February is still a month away, and there are no guarantees about what happens between now and then. He paused. But I know who I want to build it with. I've known since you sat on the very edge of my couch like you were ready to run, and looked at me like I was just another difficult customer. Zara laughed, wet and unsteady. Suni Abina's father, she said. That's who you are. Yes, he said. That's who I'm going to be. His eyes were steady and entirely serious in the way they got when he meant something absolutely. If you'll let me be. She took the ring from the box and held it, looked at the Kent colors worked into gold. February, she said. You do what you said you'd do. You get out clean. And then yes. He covered her hand with his. Both of them holding the ring together in the warmth of the Christmas night, their daughter moving gently between them, a little gravity holding everything in orbit. That's enough, he said, and she knew he meant it in the largest possible way, not just the ring or the yes or the promise of February. All of it. This life. This particular warmth in this particular house in Louisiana, while the outside world continued being complicated. That's everything, Zara agreed. Outside, the guards walked their perimeter. Somewhere in Pasadena, Park Suni slept in her chair by the window. In Accra, Abina was probably already awake for the dawn, praying her particular prayers into the new day. Alma was almost certainly not asleep, probably texting Zara's grandmother elaborate updates about the evening from the room down the hall. And inside, in the warmth, with the Christmas lights and the Kent cloth and the smell of 2 different kitchens still in the air, Zara let herself believe in February. Let herself believe in what came after. She'd crossed an ocean once for a dream she could barely see the shape of yet. She'd learned that the things worth having were usually the things you couldn't have planned for, couldn't have written down in any list of sensible goals. They arrived sideways, in the middle of a shift you were trying to get through, at a VIP table you'd been assigned against your better judgment, in the form of a man who looked at you and forgot, for one moment, to be dangerous. Suni Abina was going to be born into a world that was changing because of her. Zara had watched her father begin to change already, could see the outline of who he was becoming the way you can see the shape of land through morning fog, still partly obscured but undeniably there. She was going to be the kind of woman who held rooms, Zara thought. The way her father held rooms, but warmer. The way Abina held rooms, but younger. She was going to be the specific combination of every person who had loved her before she arrived, and she was going to be entirely herself, and she was going to have a name that carried 2 countries in it. That was enough of a future to believe in. More than enough. Min-Jae stayed through Christmas Day and drove back to New Orleans the morning after, and Zara stood at the window and watched the car until it disappeared, which was something she'd promised herself she wouldn't do because it felt too much like all the waiting she'd watched her grandmother do, all those years, for things that didn't come back. But this was different. She understood the difference now, the one between waiting passively for something to happen and standing firm in the certain knowledge of your own ground. She had Suni turning in the dark. She had an exam to pass in January. She had her grandmother to call, and Amma to feed, and Jiwoo to teach another dish from scratch, and pages of nursing material to read, and a ring she'd put back in its box and was saving for February. She had herself. That had always been enough to begin with. She put her hand against the window glass where the morning light was coming in, warm and gold, all the way from somewhere very far away. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and February was coming. If you've made it this far, beautiful souls, then you already know that this story is far from finished. Min-Jae still has a reckoning coming with Victor, and promises are easier made in the warmth of Christmas night than kept in the cold light of a world that doesn't let go easily. Zara still has an ocean between her and the grandmother who sold her gold for a plane ticket. And Suni Abina is still becoming, still a heartbeat on a screen, still the answer to a question neither of them knew they were asking. Hit that like button if this story is living in your chest the way it's living in mine. Drop a comment telling me what you think February looks like for these 2, and subscribe so you're right here when we unfold the next part together. Because trust me, we're only halfway through.